The planet of Virelia was unlike anything most civilizations in the galaxy had ever seen. Its surface shimmered with crystalline forests, and the cities rose like towers of glass and light, reflecting the twin suns that hovered in its sky. The Virelians, the intelligent beings who called this planet home, had built their society on knowledge, harmony, and advanced technology. They were explorers at heart, always seeking understanding rather than conquest. Their architecture combined elegance with functionality. Homes and public spaces were constructed from materials that glowed faintly in the dark, and streets flowed seamlessly into gardens and public squares. Life here had always been peaceful, and the Virelians had believed their way of life was secure, insulated from the chaos that often erupted elsewhere in the galaxy. But all of that changed when the invaders arrived. At first the attacks were subtle. Ships would appear at the edge of the atmosphere, barely noticeable, scanning and probing the defenses. Then came the first strikes. Explosions shattered the tranquil night skies, and brilliant crystalline towers crumbled as the invaders unleashed weapons that warped matter itself. Panic spread quickly among the population. The Virelians had never fought a true war. Their knowledge was advanced, yes, but their civilization had grown complacent, relying on diplomacy and intelligence rather than military might. Many citizens fled to underground shelters or huddled in safe zones, while others tried desperately to defend their homes with whatever technology was at hand. Despite their best efforts, it became clear very quickly that the invaders were more than just powerful, they were relentless, precise, and merciless. The Virelian Council, a group of elders and leaders who had guided the planet for generations, convened in emergency. Their chambers, usually a place of calm deliberation, now buzzed with tension and fear. Holographic maps of the planet flickered with red blots, indicating areas already under attack. Discussions turned heated as leaders debated strategies and possibilities. "We cannot hold them," one elder admitted, his voice trembling. "Our defenses are designed for peace, not war. Every moment we fight, we lose more ground." Another council member, a scientist who had spent decades studying interstellar communication, proposed a desperate solution. "If we cannot repel them ourselves, we must call for help. There must be someone, somewhere in the galaxy, capable of assisting us." The decision was unanimous. Virelia would send out an SOS, not just a routine distress signal, but a call for aid strong enough to reach the farthest corners of space. But this was no ordinary plea. The Virelians were cautious by nature, and they knew that broadcasting their location came with risks. There was a chance that in revealing their coordinates they might attract not allies, but further enemies. Yet the alternative inaction was unthinkable. The council tasked the scientist Lyra with crafting the message. She was known for her brilliance and her understanding of interstellar communication. Every word of the SOS had to convey urgency, fear, and the scale of the danger, without inviting unintended consequences. Lyra worked tirelessly, using every resource at her disposal. She compiled visual records of the attacks, data on the invaders' technology, and maps of Virelia's cities. She encoded their history, culture, and achievements into the message, hoping that any civilization receiving it would understand that the plea came from beings worthy of preservation. Yet, even as she crafted the message, doubt gnawed at her. Could anyone possibly comprehend the severity of their situation? Could anyone hear them across the vast, cold expanse of space? Her doubts were interrupted by another wave of attacks. Alarms blared as the invaders breached a major city district. The crystalline towers exploded in showers of sparks and glass shards. Fires erupted, and the cries of citizens echoed through the chaos. Lyra knew that every second counted. The SOS had to be sent immediately, for any delay could mean total annihilation. When the message finally launched into the void, it carried not only coordinates and descriptions but the raw emotion of a civilization facing extinction. It was a message of fear, hope, and desperation, compressed into a signal designed to traverse light years of empty space. Lyra and the council watched as it disappeared into the darkness, unsure whether it would reach anyone, or if it would vanish into the cosmic abyss, unheard and unheeded. Days passed, and the attacks intensified. The invaders adapted quickly, learning the layout of the cities, exploiting weaknesses, and cutting off supply routes. Every defensive measure the Virelians deployed seemed to be anticipated and countered. Civilians lived in constant fear, moving cautiously between safe zones and emergency shelters. The once vibrant planet seemed to shrink under the shadow of the relentless enemy, and the Virelians felt the crushing weight of hopelessness. Even amid the chaos, life continued in small, human-like ways. Families tried to maintain routines, children clinging to games and stories as a distraction from the terror around them. Markets and communal kitchens provided what little food and water could be gathered. While medics and engineers worked tirelessly to repair damaged infrastructure, Lyra herself moved between shelters and command centers, guiding defense efforts while maintaining hope that the SOS would be answered. Her determination inspired those around her, even as despair threatened to overwhelm them all. The message she had sent out was their only lifeline, their only chance at survival. It was during one of these moments of anxious waiting that the first unusual signs appeared. Far in the distance, a glint of movement caught the attention of Virelia's early warning sensors. At first, the council thought it was another wave of invaders, but the movement was different, larger, more purposeful, and moving with confidence rather than malice. As the object drew closer, the air trembled under the gravitational disturbance of massive ships entering the atmosphere. It was unlike anything Varelia had ever experienced. Citizens fled to shelter, unsure whether these newcomers were allies or a new, even greater threat. From the surface, the ships appeared immense, black and armored, yet strangely elegant in their design. They radiated power and danger simultaneously, sending shivers through those who saw them. The Varelians could only watch, their hearts pounding with a mix of terror and hope. If the SOS had reached someone, these could be their rescuers, but at what cost? These beings did not look like saviors in any traditional sense. They seemed unstoppable, and their presence alone suggested a force beyond comprehension. Lyra realized that this could be the answer to their prayers, but also feared that survival might demand more than courage. It might demand complete surrender to powers they could neither predict nor control. The Varelians waited silently, holding their breath as the mysterious ships drew closer, unsure if salvation or annihilation had arrived. Through this period of tension, the SOS remained their symbol of hope. It was proof that they had reached out, that they had dared to believe someone might answer their call. And as the colossal shapes of the newcomers filled the skies, the aliens realized that the universe was far larger and stranger than they had ever imagined. In their moment of greatest despair, they had ventured to trust in forces beyond their understanding, sending a plea that spanned light years. And now, something had heard them, whether friend or something far more terrifying. The hope of survival flickered once more across Varalia, fragile but alive. Even as the invaders continued their relentless assault, the Varelians began to feel a cautious sense of optimism. The presence of these mysterious newcomers promised intervention, though at the same time their intimidating nature filled the citizens with awe and fear. For the first time in weeks, the alien population dared to imagine the possibility of surviving the seemingly unstoppable force threatening their home. The SOS, their desperate plea, had not been ignored. Across unimaginable distances of space, a response had arrived, and it was unlike anything the Varelians or any other civilization had ever seen. And so, Varelia waited, caught between hope and fear, as the signal they had sent out brought something ancient, powerful, and unimaginable to their world. Their lives, their cities, and their very civilization hung in the balance, and the answer to their desperate plea would soon reveal itself in a way that no one could have predicted. The sky above Varelia darkened in an almost unnatural way as the shapes in the distance grew larger. At first it was difficult for the eyes to focus on them, for they did not resemble any ships or aircraft the Varelians had ever seen. These were not smooth or streamlined like their own crafts, nor were they elegant in the way that interstellar transports from other peaceful civilizations tended to be. They were enormous, massive, and armored in black, reflecting no light but absorbing it, creating an almost ominous shadow against the bright skies. As they drew closer, the air itself seemed to vibrate, and the ground trembled under a gravitational pressure that had no equal. The citizens, hiding in their shelters and atop towers, you could only stare wide-eyed as the colossal fleet appeared in the sky like a storm of living metal. Lyra and the council watched from their command center, their fear mixed with an unexplainable, even as the invaders continued to press their attacks below. The arrival of these newcomers changed the atmosphere of the planet. Every sensor, every scan, every detection device was filled with data that suggested power beyond comprehension. The fleet did not move in the chaotic, unpredictable patterns of the invaders. They advanced with precision, deliberate and controlled, as though the very rules of space and physics bent around their presence. It was clear that these beings had not just traveled to Varelia, they had arrived with intent, with strategy, and perhaps most importantly, with a purpose that was not yet fully understood. The invaders, upon noticing the newcomers, halted briefly, as if sensing a power far greater than their own. Some attempted to reorganize, forming defensive lines and preparing for engagement. Others seemed to hesitate, scanning and reassessing the situation. This pause, though brief, gave the Varelians a glimpse of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, they had not called out into the void in vain. The council members exchanged nervous glances. Lyra's fingers hovered over her control panel as she calculated possibilities. Could these new arrivals be allies, or were they simply another, more terrifying force that would view Varelia as a battlefield for their own purposes? The uncertainty was agonizing. As the fleet descended into the planet's atmosphere, their true scale became horrifyingly clear. Each ship was larger than the tallest Varelian towers, longer than entire city districts, and wide enough to block out sunlight in patches. They emitted a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the air and the ground alike, creating an atmosphere of tension and anticipation. The people of Varelia, many of whom had never experienced fear on such a scale, felt their hearts pound with a combination of dread and relief. This was no gentle rescue. This was a force designed for war. The aliens realized that whoever these beings were, they were here to fight, and nothing would stop them from fulfilling their purpose. The first signs of the Deathworlders' approach were subtle but unmistakable. Smaller crafts, almost like drones, deployed ahead of the main fleet, scanning the terrain, mapping enemy positions, and assessing structural weaknesses in the invaders' formations. Their movements were swift and precise, faster than any Varelian vessel, and they seemed to anticipate every potential threat. Lyra's eyes followed their flight patterns on the holographic display, trying to comprehend their tactics. It was unlike anything she had seen in her lifetime. The drones did not just gather information, they adapted in real time. When an invader attempted to counter their movements, the drones responded instantly, altering trajectories, adjusting weapon protocols, and neutralizing threats with chilling efficiency. The main fleet, following closely behind, began to deploy its ground forces. Armored exosuits, massive vehicles, and autonomous combat units descended with terrifying speed and force. Their landing was calculated, each drop zone chosen for maximum tactical advantage. The Varelians, witnessing this, were simultaneously terrified and awed. These newcomers were not here to negotiate or offer guidance, they were here to dominate, to end the conflict on their terms. Their sheer presence forced the invaders into retreat, disrupting formations that had seemed unshakable just moments before. Entire divisions of the enemy were scattered in the opening moments, thrown into chaos by a force that seemed unstoppable, even as the Deathworlders advanced. The aliens began to notice something unexpected. Despite their intimidating appearance and overwhelming power, there was a method to their actions that suggested strategic intelligence rather than mindless destruction. They targeted enemy forces with deadly accuracy while avoiding unnecessary damage to civilian areas wherever possible. Their attacks were surgical, precise, and brutal. The Varelians, who had feared that their cities would be collateral in a battle between these unstoppable forces, realized that the newcomers understood the stakes. They had come to save the planet, but in a manner that left no room for compromise or mercy toward the invaders. The invaders, now fully aware of the Deathworlders' might, attempted to reorganize. Ships formed, defensive arrays, and ground units repositioned to form barricades. But it was too late. Every move was anticipated and countered. The newcomers' adaptive technology and combat strategy seemed almost supernatural to the Varelians. One by one, enemy ships were disabled, and ground forces neutralized before they could react. It was a display of military power unlike anything Varalia had ever witnessed. The citizens, though terrified, began to see a glimmer of hope. They realized that survival was no longer impossible yet. The awe-inspiring nature of the Deathworlders brought its own fear. Their ships and soldiers radiated an intensity that was almost otherworldly. Varelians had never encountered beings who thrived in extreme conditions, who could operate in environments that would obliterate ordinary life. The Deathworlders' presence was not just powerful, it was terrifying in a way that instilled both respect and fear. Citizens whispered among themselves, questioning whether survival with such allies came at a cost they could not yet understand. The fleet's landing was unlike any parade or ceremony. They did not announce themselves with words or gestures. Instead, they arrived with a silent, unstoppable force that immediately shifted the balance of power. As the Deathworlders deployed further, Lyra noticed their efficiency in coordinating with the local defense forces. Though Varelia had never fought a proper war, the newcomers adapted to their environment and even integrated alien strategies into their approach. The Varelians observed and learned, guided by the overwhelming presence of the Deathworlders, gaining a sense of purpose and hope amidst the terror. Civilians, inspired by these displays, began to assist in ways they could, relaying information, helping maintain shelters, and guiding troops through familiar terrain. The Deathworlders did not teach or speak, they acted, and the Varelians learned by observation, understanding that survival required trust in forces they could barely comprehend. The invaders, meanwhile, were forced to retreat in disarray. Their once formidable confidence had been shattered by the arrival of a force they could not anticipate. Entire fleets retreated from the atmosphere, and ground units fell back to regroup. The Deathworlders did not give chase recklessly, but instead established control over key strategic points, preventing the enemy from reorganizing. Every action they took was calculated, efficient, and devastating. The Varelians could hardly believe what they were witnessing. They had called for help in their most desperate hour, and the universe had responded not with gentle assistance, but with a force that obliterated the opposition with terrifying precision. As the battle unfolded, the atmosphere on Varelia was electric with tension. Citizens watched in awe as the Deathworlders' units moved through the landscape, their weapons and vehicles overwhelming enemy positions. Fires raged across the battlefield, and smoke from destroyed invader technology filled the air. Yet, through all the destruction, the Deathworlders maintained control. Nothing was wasted, nothing was misdirected. Every strike served a purpose, and the alien observers began to understand that this was not random violence, it was an absolute demonstration of power, meant to secure their survival. Lyra, standing at the command center, felt a mixture of relief and fear. The SOS had worked. Someone had come, but these were not gentle saviors. They were warriors, beings whose existence was intertwined with war and survival in ways that Varelia had never known. Their methods were alien, terrifying, and awe-inspiring. Citizens cheered cautiously when invader forces fell, yet a deep instinctual fear remained. They had survived, yes, but they had witnessed a force that seemed to operate beyond morality or compassion, guided solely by purpose and the need to dominate threats completely. As the day drew on, the first reports of secure zones began to reach the Council. The invaders had been pushed back from several critical areas, and the citizens in those zones were able to emerge cautiously from their shelters. There was a sense of cautious optimism, tempered by the understanding that this was only the beginning. The Deathworlders had arrived, and while they were clearly here to help, they were not gentle. Their presence was both salvation and a stark reminder of the power that now existed on Varelia's surface. By nightfall, the alien cities bore the marks of both terror and hope. The invaders had been forced to retreat, but the scars of battle remained. Fires burned in distant districts, and shattered buildings reflected the glow of the twin suns setting on the horizon. Yet amid the chaos, the people of Varalia began to understand that the SOS they had sent had not been ignored. Across unimaginable distances of space, their plea had reached a species capable of turning the tide of war with overwhelming force. They had survived the first day of this new era, but they also understood that the Deathworlders' methods were as alien as they were unstoppable, and the coming days would reveal the full extent of what it meant to be under the protection and power of such beings. The first clash between the Deathworlders and the invaders was unlike anything the Varelians had ever witnessed. From the very beginning, it was clear that the newcomers were not only powerful but terrifyingly efficient. Their approach to combat was methodical, almost surgical, as if the entire battlefield were a chessboard and every movement pre-planned and calculated. The invaders, who had once believed themselves unstoppable, found themselves thrown into chaos within minutes of the first strikes. Ships that had once dominated the skies were disabled or destroyed before they could launch counterattacks. Ground units, heavily armed and confident, were obliterated by weapons that seemed to anticipate their movements. The Varelians, hiding behind shattered walls and among the remnants of their once pristine cities, could hardly comprehend what they were witnessing. Explosions lit up the sky as the first volleys of energy from the Deathworlders, ships and ground units hit the enemy formations. Each blast was precise, not random. The invaders had expected a chaotic battle, perhaps even a drawn-out fight that could tire the newcomers. Instead, they were met with immediacy and perfection. Vehicles and enemy machines were destroyed in a way that left no survivors, no chance for recovery, no possibility of regrouping. Every strike was calculated for maximum effect. For the Varelians watching, it was terrifying and awe-inspiring at the same time. Their eyes widened as they realized that these beings had brought not just help, but a force capable of utterly rewriting the rules of war. From the moment the first shots were fired, the invaders began to scatter. They tried to form defensive lines, to regroup and mount a counteroffensive, but every attempt was anticipated and neutralized. The Deathworlders moved with unrelenting speed, their exosuits and vehicles adapting instantly to new threats. When an enemy unit attempted to flank or ambush them, it was met with overwhelming firepower within moments. There was no hesitation, no error, no mercy. The battlefield became a demonstration of controlled destruction. With the invaders struggling to survive against forces they could neither predict nor understand, the Varelians themselves, who had spent the past days hiding or scrambling to maintain their fragile defenses, began to participate in the battle in small but important ways. Under the guidance of the Deathworlders' silent coordination, the aliens relayed information about enemy positions, identified weak points in structures or defenses, and even assisted in moving supplies and guiding civilians away from danger zones. Their contributions were minor in comparison to the sheer destructive power of the newcomers, yet they began to feel a sense of involvement for the first time since the invaders had arrived. Hope was rekindling, fragile but present, amidst the chaos of war. The battlefield was a mixture of light and shadow. Crystalline towers that had survived the initial attacks now reflected the explosions, creating a surreal, almost blinding spectacle. Energy beams cut through the skies, igniting enemy ships and vehicles in brilliant flashes. Smoke rose in thick clouds from streets and open squares as damaged machinery smoldered. The ground trembled with each explosion, and debris flew in every direction. Citizens peered cautiously from shelters, trying to comprehend the full scale of the fight. Many could not understand the tactics, the strategy, or even the technology, but the results were undeniable. The invaders were losing. The Deathworlders' efficiency was absolute, and each moment of the battle demonstrated that they were a force the galaxy had rarely, if ever, seen. Amid the chaos, one of the invader commanders attempted a bold maneuver. A fleet of smaller ships swooped down to try to overwhelm the Deathworlders' ground forces, aiming to break their lines and create space for the remaining invaders to regroup. The Varelians held their breath, expecting disaster, yet within moments, the Deathworlders' response was executed flawlessly. Targeting systems adapted instantaneously, energy shields were deployed, and the attacking fleet was neutralized with precision. The smaller ships were either destroyed mid-air or forced into retreat, leaving the invaders scrambling in confusion. It became clear to the Varelians that their new allies not only reacted quickly but anticipated enemy behavior in ways that defied comprehension. The Deathworlders' ground units were equally terrifying. Their exosuits, towering and armored, moved through streets and open plains with terrifying efficiency. Each step crushed debris and obstacles effortlessly, and their weapons systems neutralized enemy fortifications with frightening speed. They were relentless, adaptive, and utterly focused. Even as enemy units attempted to hide or regroup behind terrain or ruined buildings, the newcomers found them, eliminating threats before they could mount any counterattack. The Varelians, observing this, realized that the Deathworlders did not fight like any army they had seen in history. They fought like nature itself, unstoppable and unavoidable, reshaping the battlefield with every movement. Despite their fear, the Varelians could not help but be inspired by what they saw. Citizens who had spent days cowering in shelters began to understand that survival was possible, even against overwhelming odds. They began to assist in minor ways, helping transport supplies to safe zones, guiding survivors through partially destroyed districts, and providing intelligence about enemy positions. Every small action they took was amplified by the efficiency of the Deathworlders' operations. It was as if the newcomers' presence created not just safety but a sense of purpose for the people who had been paralyzed by fear. For the first time, the Varelians felt they were not entirely helpless. Yet with every act of awe-inspiring power, the Varelians also felt fear. The Deathworlders' presence was intimidating in a way that was difficult to describe. They did not speak, they did not negotiate, they did not show mercy to the invaders. Their focus was total, and their actions were unflinchingly brutal. Civilians whispered among themselves, wondering if survival under such protection came at a cost they could not yet understand. These were not traditional heroes, they were forces of nature, and witnessing them was both exhilarating and terrifying. The Varelians realized that the scale of power they had invited into their world could just as easily destroy them if misused amid the fighting. Lyra and the Council observed every detail. They tracked the movements of the Deathworlders' units, marveling at the coordination and precision that allowed them to neutralize multiple enemy battalions simultaneously. Entire sections of invader fortifications were destroyed in moments, and the remaining forces were forced into retreat. The efficiency of the newcomers was breathtaking, and the Council realized that the fate of Virelia was no longer in question. Not because the planet had suddenly gained new strength, but because an unstoppable external force had arrived to intervene. The invaders, demoralized and disoriented, attempted desperate last-ditch efforts. They sent raiding parties to try and flank the Deathworlders, deployed decoy ships to confuse sensors, and attempted to sabotage Varelian defenses from behind the lines. Each attempt was met with instantaneous adaptation. The Deathworlders' technology and combat intuition allowed them to identify threats before they fully materialized. Every trap set by the enemy was neutralized, every offensive move countered before it could succeed. The invaders' confidence, which had once been unshakable, was replaced by fear, confusion, and panic. For the first time in the history of the conflict, it was clear who truly held control of the battlefield. As the clash continued, the Varelians began to understand the full meaning of their plea for help. Their SOS had not simply brought reinforcements, it had brought a force capable of completely transforming the conflict. Every step the Deathworlders took, every strike they executed, and every defensive maneuver they implemented shifted the balance irrevocably in favor of the planet's defenders. Citizens who had felt powerless now witnessed a reality in which hope was tangible, though accompanied by the sobering recognition of the sheer destructive potential of their allies. Survival was possible, but it would not come without awe, fear, and respect for the force that had answered their call. By the time the sun began to set, the first clash had clearly turned in favor of the Deathworlders, and the enemy forces were retreating in disarray, their formations broken, their morale shattered. Streets that had once been battlegrounds were now dominated by the newcomers' units, and key strategic positions had been secured. Fires burned in distant parts of the city, and smoke mingled with the fading sunlight, creating a surreal, almost apocalyptic beauty. Yet amidst the chaos, a sense of relief began to spread. The planet had survived the first major encounter. The Varelians, who had spent days in fear and uncertainty, could finally breathe a cautious sigh of relief. Still, there was no celebration. The Deathworlders did not linger or show signs of triumph. They moved with a calm, calculated efficiency, securing positions, neutralizing remaining threats, and preparing for the next phase of engagement. The Varelians realized that while they had been saved from immediate destruction, the war was far from over. The newcomers' methods were harsh, their approach unrelenting, and their power absolute. Yet for the first time, the people of Irelia could see a future where survival was possible, where hope was tangible, and where the invaders' reign of terror could be overturned. The first clash ended not with fanfare or celebration, but with a profound sense of awe and gratitude mingled with fear. The Varelians had witnessed a force that was unlike anything in their history. They had survived, thanks to a power that was terrifying, unstoppable, and merciless toward their enemies. And in that realization, they also understood that the universe was far larger, stranger, and more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The Deathworlders had arrived, and the first clash had proven that when they intervened, nothing could stand in their way. The Varelians would live to see another day, but they would never forget the terrifying spectacle of that battle. nor the overwhelming force that had come to their aid. The battle on Varelia had shifted from chaos to a terrifyingly controlled conflict. The first clash had ended, but the war was far from over. The invaders, though shaken and demoralized, were still scattered across the planet, regrouping in pockets and attempting to find weaknesses in the Deathworlders' strategy. They hoped to exploit unfamiliar terrain, hidden cities, and the inexperience of the Varelians themselves. What they did not understand was that the Deathworlders' approach was far beyond anything the invaders had ever faced. They were not merely fighting, they were executing a calculated campaign, a methodical elimination of every threat, leaving nothing to chance and nothing to luck. Every enemy maneuver, every hidden force, every desperate attempt at counterattack was anticipated, studied, and countered. The invaders soon realized that the Deathworlders were not like any opponent they had encountered. These newcomers adapted to every situation in real time. If an enemy weapon was deployed, it would be rendered useless almost instantly. If a new formation was tried, it would collapse under the weight of overwhelming firepower before it could even gain momentum. They moved with terrifying speed, almost as if they could see the outcome of every action before it happened. The invaders' frustration and fear grew, and what had once been confidence turned into desperation. Entire battalions that had previously marched without hesitation were now retreating in disarray, unable to withstand the relentless precision of the Deathworlders' assault. Watching this unfold was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Their saviors were not gentle, they were unstoppable, and the sheer power they wielded was almost incomprehensible. Massive vehicles and exosuits moved across the cities and plains with incredible efficiency, neutralizing threats with surgical precision. The air was filled with the hum of energy weapons, the rumble of landing craft, and the explosions of enemy installations. Every strike was purposeful, every movement deliberate. There was no waste, no hesitation, no mercy for the invaders. Civilians who had once hidden in terror began to recognize that survival was now possible, but only if the Deathworlders were allowed to carry out their plan without interference in this new phase of battle. The invaders tried to regroup in strategic locations, attempting to form new defensive lines and launch They occupied high ground positions, fortified industrial zones, and abandoned urban areas, hoping that the chaotic terrain could give them some advantage. But the Deathworlders had already anticipated these possibilities. Their units adapted instantly, scanning for hidden threats, mapping enemy positions, and deploying specialized teams to neutralize every potential danger. Their weapons adjusted to changing environments automatically, destroying fortifications, disabling vehicles, and neutralizing enemy personnel without delay. Every movement of the invaders was met with overwhelming counteraction, leaving them with no room to maneuver or recover. Lyra and the Council observed this carefully. The Varelians had never fought a war like this before, and even the most advanced simulations could not have prepared them for the reality of the Deathworlders' tactics. Yet, for the first time, they began to understand the true scale of the intervention. The invaders' resistance was being dismantled piece by piece, not by chance, but by a force that operated with perfect logic and lethal efficiency. Entire enemy units were rendered ineffective in moments, and their technology, once feared, was now being turned against them in ways that left no survivors. The Council realized that while their civilization had sent out a desperate plea for help, the force that had answered was beyond comprehension, beyond morality, and beyond any conventional understanding of power. On the ground, the Deathworlders' troops moved like an unstoppable tide. Their exosuits crushed debris and obstacles effortlessly, and their weapons neutralized enemy fortifications with terrifying speed. When the invaders attempted to hide behind walls, vehicles, or natural cover, the newcomers adapted instantly, neutralizing threats before they could mount an attack. Their movements were coordinated, almost as if they were a single organism rather than a collection of individual soldiers. Every unit supported the others seamlessly, creating a relentless pressure on the enemy that left no room for error. Civilians who had been cowering in shelters began to see that victory was possible, though the sight of such power was also frightening. The invaders tried to deploy reinforcements, bringing in ships from orbit and sending new ground units into the fray. They attempted to launch surprise attacks from unexpected directions, hoping to catch the Deathworlders off guard. But their efforts were futile. The newcomers' sensors and adaptive strategies accounted for every possibility. Any movement of enemy forces was immediately countered. Ships attempting to flank were destroyed before they could reach their targets, and ground units were neutralized before they could establish defensive positions. The invaders' desperation grew with each failure, and panic spread among their ranks. They realized that they were facing not just a superior force, but a force that was almost impossible to defeat. As the battle intensified, the Varelians themselves began to contribute more actively. Inspired by the precision and efficiency of their allies, they relayed information about enemy positions, helped move supplies and civilians, and coordinated small-scale attacks under the silent guidance of the Deathworld. Even though their efforts were minor in comparison to the overwhelming power of the newcomers, they played a critical role in ensuring that the Deathworlders had the knowledge and local guidance needed to execute their strategy flawlessly. The Varelians were beginning to see themselves not as helpless victims, but as participants in a larger, coordinated effort that could turn the tide of the war. The invaders, however, refused to surrender. They launched desperate attacks, targeting key urban areas, attempting sabotage, and sending raiding parties into what they thought were lightly defended zones. Every attempt was met with overwhelming force. The Deathworlders neutralized threats with terrifying speed, adapting to each new tactic almost instantly. Energy blasts tore through the enemy ranks, disabling vehicles, destroying fortifications, and eliminating personnel in moments. The invaders' morale began to collapse entirely, their confidence replaced by confusion and fear. The Varelians, though terrified by the scale of destruction, could see that victory was within reach. Survival was no longer just a hope, it was a tangible reality. Despite the efficiency of the Deathworlders, their presence was inspiring and terrifying. Their approach to battle left no doubt that they were not ordinary allies. They did not negotiate, hesitate, or show mercy. Their purpose was absolute: to eliminate the enemy and secure the survival of the planet at all costs. Civilians whispered among themselves, recognizing that the power they were witnessing was beyond their understanding. These beings were not gentle saviors, they were unstoppable warriors whose methods were as alien as they were lethal. And yet, for all their terror, they were their only hope. By the time the sun began to set over Varelia, the invaders were in full retreat. Entire battalions had been destroyed, key positions captured, and enemy technology neutralized. Fires burned across previously contested areas, smoke mingling with the fading sunlight, creating a surreal and apocalyptic scene. The Varelians emerging cautiously from shelters to awe the scale of what had just occurred. Their planet had survived the first stage of this relentless conflict, but it had done so under the protection of a force that was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. Lyra walked through the city, observing both destruction and survival. The Deathworlders units had secured major zones, destroyed enemy fortifications, and established control over strategic areas. Civilians began to rebuild small sections, salvaging what they could from damaged structures, repairing communication lines, and assisting the wounded. Though the battle had been devastating, it had also been transformative. The Varelians were learning the meaning of survival under the protection of a force unlike any they had ever known. They were beginning to understand that victory was possible, but that it came with the sobering recognition of the power that had saved them. Even as the invaders retreated, the Deathworlders continued to move with calm precision. They secured supply lines, monitored remaining threats, and prepared for the next wave of combat. Their approach was systematic, leaving nothing to chance. The Varelians realized that while immediate danger had been averted, the war was far from over. The newcomers' methods were relentless, their power overwhelming, and their presence a constant reminder of the force that now controlled the battlefield. Survival was no longer a matter of luck, it was the result of strategic, calculated intervention by beings whose capabilities were almost unimaginable. They witnessed the absolute dominance of the Deathworlders, their ability to neutralize threats with terrifying efficiency, and the transformative impact of their presence. Entire enemy forces were destroyed or scattered, key areas secured, and civilians were given the first real sense of hope they had felt in weeks. And yet, for all the relief and inspiration, there was an underlying understanding that the universe was far larger, stranger, and more dangerous than they had ever imagined. Their salvation had arrived in the form of beings whose methods were alien, terrifying, and unstoppable. By the end of the day, Varelia stood battered but alive. The invaders had been repelled in major sectors, their power diminished, and their strategy in disarray. The Deathworlders, having secured control, prepared for the next phase of their campaign. The Varelians, exhausted but inspired, began to rebuild and regroup, realizing that they had witnessed not just survival, but a display of power unlike any in their history. They had called out for help, and the universe had answered not gently, not with negotiation, but with unstoppable force. Their world had been saved, at least for now, by a presence that was terrifying, or inspiring, and utterly incomprehensible. The battle on Varelia had shifted dramatically. The initial chaos and destruction had given way to a relentless, systematic push by the Deathworlders, and the invaders were now fully aware that their chances of victory were slipping away. The first clashes had shattered their confidence, and the strategic superiority of the newcomers left them scrambling for any foothold. No longer could they operate with arrogance or overconfidence. Every move they made was calculated and observed, but it was always anticipated. The Deathworlders were adapting in real time, nullifying attacks before they could even take shape, and forcing the enemy into a defensive posture that quickly became unsustainable. The invaders' morale, once a source of fear for the Varelians, was collapsing under the weight of this unstoppable force. From the ground, the Varelians observed the magnitude of what had arrived to save them. Massive exosuits moved through the cities and plains with terrifying efficiency, crushing obstacles and neutralizing enemy fortifications with methodical precision. Their weapons were adaptive, capable of adjusting to the terrain, enemy formations, and even unexpected tactics within seconds. Even when invader forces attempted to create diversions or ambushes, the newcomers countered flawlessly. Each encounter, no matter how small, demonstrated the absolute mastery of the Deathworlders in combat. The citizens, who had spent weeks cowering in fear, they began to emerge from hiding, cautiously optimistic that survival was possible. The invaders attempted to consolidate their remaining forces into fortified positions, seeking to create defensive strongholds that could withstand the newcomers' assault. They established barricades, deployed energy shields, and fortified cities with heavy weaponry. However, the Deathworlders' approach was precise and relentless. Entire enemy fortresses were dismantled within moments, their weapons neutralized, their vehicles destroyed, and their personnel eliminated before they could mount any significant resistance. Every attempt at defense by the invaders failed, not because of brute force alone, but because of superior strategy, adaptability, and a near-psychic anticipation of enemy behavior. The Varelians could only watch in awe as this unstoppable force reshaped the battlefield with terrifying clarity. Amid the carnage, the Varelians began to participate more actively. Inspired by the Deathworlders' efficiency, they relayed critical intelligence about enemy movements, directed supply lines, and helped coordinate small-scale defensive actions. Even their limited contributions had a significant impact, amplified by the newcomers' ability to integrate local knowledge into their strategy. For the first time, the citizens felt like active participants rather than helpless bystanders. Their hope grew fragile but undeniable as they saw that survival and even victory were now within reach. The invaders, sensing the tide of battle turning irrevocably against them, became increasingly desperate. They launched high-risk assaults, trying to flank the Deathworlders' units, breach their formations, and disrupt their coordination. Yet every maneuver was countered almost instantly. Adaptive weapons targeted incoming forces before they could strike. Defensive units deployed automatically in anticipation of ambushes. Reinforcements, whether on the ground or in orbit, were neutralized before they could make an impact. The invaders' fear escalated into panic, and chaos spread through their ranks. What had once been organized and confident now crumbled under the relentless pressure of a force that left no room for error. From the perspective of the spectacle was both horrifying and inspiring. They witnessed a level of precision and power that defied comprehension. Energy beams cut through enemy fortifications as if slicing through paper. Vehicles and ships exploded in brilliant displays of light, while exosuits moved with unmatched efficiency, crushing obstacles and neutralizing enemy units in seconds. There was no mercy, no hesitation, and no wasted effort. Each action was purposeful and calculated, demonstrating that survival was possible only because of a force whose understanding of war surpassed anything imaginable. As the battle continued, the invaders attempted one final gambit. They concentrated forces around a critical energy nexus that powered several of their defensive systems, hoping to turn the tide by capturing or destroying it. This desperate maneuver was meant to create confusion and buy them time to regroup. Yet, the Deathworlders responded with a speed and precision that was almost supernatural. Advanced sensors detected the movement instantly, and adaptive units were deployed to intercept and neutralize the threat before it could reach its target. Entire squads of enemy forces were destroyed in moments, and their ships were disabled before they could escape. Panic turned into utter chaos as the invaders realized they could not outmaneuver, outthink, or overpower this unstoppable force. Watching the invaders collapse, began to understand the duality of the Deathworlders' presence. Their methods were terrifying and absolute, leaving no room for negotiation or mercy. Yet, without them, survival would have been impossible. The citizens felt a complex mixture of fear, awe, and gratitude. They were witnessing the power of beings who thrived in extreme conditions, who operated beyond ordinary understanding, and who had arrived to ensure that their civilization would not be destroyed. It was a level of intervention that the Varelians had never experienced, and it left a lasting impression on their minds and hearts. With the invaders' remaining forces scattered, the Deathworlders pushed forward with controlled precision. Entire regions that had been under enemy control were liberated within hours. Strategic positions were secured, supply lines restored, and civilians protected from lingering threats. The battlefield, once a scene of chaos and destruction, began to reflect the careful, methodical approach of the newcomers. Every victory was decisive, leaving no chance for the enemy to recover. The Varelians, for the first time in weeks, felt a sense of tangible relief. Survival was no longer just hope, it was a visible, undeniable reality. Even as the battle raged, the Deathworlders' units demonstrated a terrifying adaptability. They adjusted tactics in real time, coordinated across vast distances, and neutralized any unexpected threat almost instantly. The invaders' attempts at unconventional strategies were futile, as the newcomers anticipated, adapted, and countered each move with precision. Energy shields were deployed, weapons adjusted, and reinforcements moved to critical areas automatically. It was as if the battlefield itself responded to their will, reshaping itself to ensure that victory was inevitable. The Varelians could only watch, their hearts pounding, as this overwhelming display of tactical supremacy unfolded before them. By the end of the first full day of this new offensive, the invaders were in full retreat. Their morale was shattered, their formations destroyed, and their key positions occupied or neutralized. Fires burned in distant districts, and smoke from destroyed vehicles and structures filled the air. The citizens, cautiously emerging from shelters, could see the scale of destruction and the absolute efficiency of their saviors. Though terrified by the sheer power of the Deathworlders, they were also filled with hope for the first time in weeks. Survival was now a tangible possibility, and the planet's future, though still uncertain, was no longer entirely bleak. Lyra and the Council surveyed the battlefield from their command center. Every report confirmed what they had already witnessed. The invaders' resistance had been shattered, their forces scattered, and their technology neutralized. Yet the Council also recognized the sobering reality that the Deathworlders' methods were harsh, ruthless, and absolute. There was no negotiation, no compromise, and no mercy for the enemy. Survival for Veralia had been achieved not through diplomacy or conventional defense, but through the intervention of a force that operated beyond ordinary understanding, a force that brought both hope and fear in equal measure. In the aftermath of the offensive, the Verelians began to rebuild and recover. Civilians worked alongside the Deathworlders, though the newcomers did not participate in the rebuilding themselves. Their role was complete once the threat had been neutralized, leaving the planet's inhabitants to restore what had been damaged. The Verelians salvaged materials, repaired communication lines, and helped the wounded. Despite the fear and destruction, there was a renewed sense of purpose among the people. They had survived the onslaught, thanks to beings whose methods they could barely comprehend, and the memory of the battle would shape their civilization for generations to come. Even as Verelia began to recover, the invaders' retreat left a clear warning. Their forces, though diminished, remained scattered across the planet, hiding and regrouping wherever they could. The Deathworlders did not linger unnecessarily but established surveillance and control over critical regions, ensuring that any resurgence would be met with immediate and overwhelming force. The Verelians watched in awe as their saviors moved with precision, securing the planet against future threats. The battle had been decisive, but the presence of such power reminded them that survival came at a cost, the cost of witnessing forces beyond their understanding. Capable of total annihilation by the time night fell, Veralia was quiet. Though the scars of battle were visible across the landscape, fires still smoldered in some districts, and smoke hung heavy in the air. Yet there was relief, hope, and cautious optimism. The invaders had been repelled, their forces shattered, and their plans undone. The Deathworlders, having fulfilled their purpose, remained a looming presence, a reminder that survival had been secured not by luck or skill, but by the intervention of a power unlike any other in the galaxy. The Verelians understood that their civilization had been saved by beings who operated on a level far beyond their comprehension. Beings whose presence was both terrifying and awe-inspiring, and whose methods were as absolute as they were decisive. The final stage of the conflict on Verelia was unlike anything the planet had ever experienced. The invaders, though shattered, were not completely defeated. Pockets of resistance still existed, hiding in ruined districts, underground tunnels, and remote wastelands. They were desperate, fearful, and unpredictable, making their remaining actions even more dangerous. Yet, the Deathworlders approached this phase of the battle with the same precision, focus, and relentless determination that had defined every previous engagement. There was no hesitation, no waste, and no mercy for the enemy. Every move they made was calculated to eliminate remaining threats while minimizing unnecessary destruction. The Verelians, observing from a mix of awe and fear, realized that the final phase would not just decide survival, it would define the future of their planet. As dawn broke over the scarred landscape, the Deathworlders' units began to sweep across the planet systematically. Massive exosuits advanced through ruined city streets, crushing debris and neutralizing enemy strongholds with precision. Vehicles, armed with adaptive weaponry, moved alongside them, destroying enemy machinery before it could react. Every strike, every maneuver, every calculated action demonstrated that these beings were not merely soldiers, they were instruments of overwhelming power and strategy. The Verelians watched as the remaining invaders attempted to organize, only to be met by a force that anticipated every tactic, every ambush, and every desperate gamble. Resistance crumbled under the sheer inevitability of the Deathworlders' advance. The remaining invader groups had little choice but to scatter. Some fled into the wilderness, hoping to regroup far from the cities. Others attempted to hide in underground complexes, relying on the terrain to mask their presence. Yet the Deathworlders' sensors and reconnaissance units detected these movements almost instantly. Flying drones scouted ahead, mapping enemy positions, relaying information to ground units, and neutralizing threats before they could mount any significant defense. The invaders' technology, once considered advanced and terrifying, proved powerless against the adaptive superior systems deployed by the newcomers. Each attempt at resistance was met with precise countermeasures, leaving no chance for survival outside the plan already laid out by the Deathworlders. Despite their fear of the newcomers, could not help but feel a sense of wonder at the scale of their efficiency. They witnessed entire enemy enclaves disappear in moments, vehicles disabled, fortifications destroyed, and personnel eliminated with terrifying precision. Even when the invaders attempted complex strategies, the Deathworlders adapted instantly, countering every move before it could gain momentum. The battlefield became a demonstration of pure strategy and execution, where the remaining enemy forces were systematically removed from the equation. The Varelians began to understand that their survival had not been a matter of luck, but of intervention by beings who operated beyond ordinary comprehension. In addition to neutralizing threats, the Deathworlders secured vital infrastructure across the planet. Energy stations, communication hubs, and supply depots were protected, ensuring that the invaders could not attempt to regain control or sabotage essential systems. Their approach was surgical, leaving no room for enemy counterattacks. They moved as a single, coordinated force, integrating every piece of information into a strategy that allowed them to dominate the battlefield completely. The Varelians observed this with a mixture of awe and fear, realizing that their world was being shaped, almost remade, by a power unlike anything they had ever known. Even as the invaders' remaining forces were neutralized, there was no hesitation in the Deathworlders' actions. Their units pressed forward relentlessly, clearing entire sectors of any remaining enemy presence. They eliminated threats efficiently, ensuring that no hidden ambush could delay their progress. Energy blasts tore through enemy barricades, exosuits moved through ruined districts with mechanical precision, and drones scanned every corner for signs of life. The Varelians, once paralyzed by fear, now began to participate actively, assisting in small ways by providing local knowledge, guiding supplies, and ensuring civilians stayed out of harm's way. Though minor compared to the Deathworlders' overwhelming power, these contributions were integrated seamlessly into the larger strategy. The invaders, realizing that their remaining options were dwindling, attempted a desperate final gambit. A heavily armed group aimed to seize a communication hub that could coordinate the last pockets of resistance. They moved with haste and secrecy, hoping that the terrain and the chaos of destruction would allow them to succeed. However, the Deathworlders' sensors and adaptive systems detected the maneuver almost immediately. Units were deployed to intercept, neutralizing the enemy group before they could achieve their objective. Explosions erupted as energy weapons disabled their vehicles, and exosuits crushed remaining combatants. The invaders' morale, already shattered, was now completely broken. They were left with no choice but to surrender, flee, or face total annihilation. Asterisk for the Varelians, the sight was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. The Deathworlders' approach left no room for negotiation, no space for compromise, and no chance for mercy toward the invaders. Yet the citizens could see that, without this intervention, their civilization would have been completely destroyed. Entire cities had been preserved, infrastructure secured, and civilians protected under a force whose methods were both ruthless and efficient. They were witnessing survival brought about not by luck, not by diplomacy, but by a power that existed on a scale they could barely comprehend. It was a mixture of relief, fear, and profound respect. As the battle continued, the Deathworlders began systematically clearing the outskirts of the planet. Remote hideouts, hidden bunkers, and abandoned supply lines were neutralized. Every area that could harbor enemy forces was thoroughly scanned and secured. Their operations were swift and absolute, leaving no opportunity for the invaders to regroup. The Varelians observed, sometimes from a distance, the methodical efficiency with which their saviors operated. Entire sections of the planet that had once been contested were now completely under control, demonstrating that the remaining resistance was both minimal and irrelevant. Survival, at last, was no longer in doubt. Throughout this final phase, the Varelians experienced the full spectrum of emotions. Fear remained ever present, as the sheer power and ruthlessness of the Deathworlders was unlike anything they had ever witnessed, or accompanied that fear, as they saw a force capable of total domination, yet acting with a singular focus on neutralizing threats rather than causing unnecessary destruction. And hope, fragile but undeniable, began to take root. They had survived the invaders' attacks. Their cities were no longer under direct threat, and their civilization had been preserved through intervention by beings whose power was incomprehensible. The invaders, fully aware that their defeat was inevitable, tried one last desperate tactic, an attempt to create a diversion by sabotaging energy grids and communication towers. They believed that causing chaos might allow some of their remaining forces to escape, yet even this was countered with terrifying precision. Drones detected the sabotage almost instantly, units were dispatched to neutralize the threat, and critical systems were protected before any damage could occur. Within moments, the attempt was entirely foiled, leaving the invaders' plan in ruins and confirming the absolute dominance of the Deathworlders. By the time night fell, the planet was finally secure. Fires from the last pockets of combat still smoldered, and smoke hung in the air over cities that had endured destruction but remained intact. The Varelians cautiously emerged from their shelters, seeing both devastation and survival. Their civilization had been saved, and the invaders were either eliminated or in full retreat, scattered and broken. The Deathworlders had completed their mission, leaving the planet under protection and observation to ensure no resurgence of the enemy could occur. For the first time in weeks, the citizens could breathe without fear. Lyra and the council moved through the city, observing both the aftermath and the remaining units of the death. There was no celebration, as these beings did not linger unnecessarily. They had acted with precision, removed the threat, and now allowed the planet to begin the process of recovery. Their presence was a reminder of both power and the price of survival. The Varelians understood that their civilization had been preserved by a force beyond their understanding, a force whose methods were ruthless, absolute, and terrifyingly efficient. In the days that followed, the Varelians began to rebuild under the shadow of the Deathworlders' intervention. The planet was scarred, but life continued. Civilians repaired infrastructure, cleared debris, and restored basic services. Though the Deathworlders did not remain as permanent guardians, their surveillance and presence in the immediate aftermath ensured that no remnants of the invaders could threaten recovery. The Varelians, inspired by both survival and the demonstration of unimaginable power, began to understand the fragility and resilience of their civilization. They had survived not through conventional means, but through the intervention of a force that operated beyond morality and comprehension, whose purpose was absolute, to secure survival at any cost. The invaders, scattered and demoralized, had no choice but to retreat into deep space or hide in remote corners of the planet. They had underestimated the Deathworlders, misjudged their strategy, and failed to anticipate their overwhelming power. Their defeat was total and unavoidable. The Varelians, witnessing the final outcome, realized the full meaning of their plea for help. Their SOS had been answered not by diplomacy or negotiation, but by a force capable of turning the tide of war in ways that no one could have imagined. They had survived, their civilization preserved, and their enemies defeated, all because of beings who had arrived with the singular purpose of ensuring victory in the final hours. The Deathworlders withdrew from active engagement but remained a presence on the planet to monitor for any resurgence of threats. Their methodical clearing of the battlefield, neutralization of enemy forces, and strategic control over key areas ensured that the planet could begin its recovery safely. The Varelians, while still fearful of the overwhelming power they had witnessed, were filled with gratitude. They had survived annihilation, and their civilization had endured because of a force beyond comprehension. The invaders were gone, the planet was secure, and the survivors could finally begin the process of rebuilding their lives. The memory of the Deathworlders' intervention would live forever, a mixture of fear, awe, and hope. Their actions had ensured survival, demonstrated overwhelming power, and left the Varelians with an understanding of the vast, incomprehensible forces that existed beyond their world. Civilization had survived, not through luck, not through conventional means, but through the intervention of a force that was absolute, terrifying, and beyond imagination.